In the early morning hours of November 30th, 1939, 21 divisions of the Red Army crossed the Finnish border along a front of more than 1,000 kilometers. More than 450,000 Soviet soldiers, 2,000 tanks, 1,000 aircraft, and heavy artillery in quantities Finland had never seen before. On the other side waited a country of 3,800,000 inhabitants, whose army barely exceeded 300,000 men. Many of them reservists called up only weeks earlier, wearing mismatched uniforms without enough helmets, with only 32 operational tanks and an air force of 114 obsolete aircraft. The disproportion was so grotesque that in Moscow, Stalin's generals had calculated the campaign would end in 2 weeks. Victory propaganda had already been printed. An orchestra had been prepared to parade in Helsinki. 105 days later, the Red Army had lost, according to figures now considered conservative, between 127,000 and 168,000 dead, and possibly more than 200,000 according to declassified Soviet sources after 1991. Finland had lost 25,000. The orchestra never paraded. But this is not only the story of the Winter War. This is the story of how a small country, surrounded, betrayed by its friends, and condemned by geography, ended up fighting against practically all the great powers of the 20th century, against the Soviet Union twice, against the United Kingdom, which formally declared war on it in December 1941, as an uncomfortable ally of Nazi Germany between 1941 and 1944, and finally, in the last months of the conflict, fighting the very same German troops with whom it had previously shared trenches, driving them out of its territory in a forgotten campaign that devastated all of Lapland. 4 intertwined wars in 6 years, a country that turned on itself twice without ever stopping fighting. To understand how Finland reached this point, one must go back to 1917. For more than a century, Finland had been a grand duchy under the Russian crown, an autonomous territory with its own parliament, its own currency, and deeply rooted Scandinavian traditions. When the Bolshevik Revolution toppled the empire of the Tsars, the Finnish Senate declared independence on December 6, 1917. Lenin, busy consolidating his own power, recognized it. But independence did not bring peace. Between January and May 1918, Finland tore itself apart in a short and brutal civil war between the Reds, supported by Soviet Russia, and the Whites, commanded by a former officer of the Imperial Russian Army named Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim. The Whites won. Almost 38,000 people died in a tiny country. The scars of that war would mark Finnish politics for decades, but they also left a certainty shared across the entire political spectrum. Finland would never again be part of Russia. During the 1920s and 1930s, the young state slowly industrialized, consolidated its parliamentary democracy, and watched with growing unease what was happening on the other side of its eastern border. Mannerheim, retired but still influential, repeatedly insisted on the need to fortify the Karelian Isthmus, that narrow strip of land between Lake Ladoga and the Gulf of Finland, through which any invasion would inevitably come. The government listened to him only half-heartedly. Resources were scarce. The line of fortifications that would later bear his name, the Mannerheim Line, was never completed to the level he wanted. Scattered bunkers, trenches, improvised anti-tank obstacles made of rocks dragged from the forests, some concrete casemates of uneven quality. Nothing comparable to the French Maginot Line, with which Soviet propaganda would later compare it to justify its own defeats. In August 1939, the world changed in a single night. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed between Hitler's Germany and Stalin's USSR, contained secret protocols that divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Finland fell into the Soviet sphere. In October, Stalin summoned a Finnish delegation to Moscow and demanded concessions that Helsinki considered unacceptable. To move the border on the Karelian Isthmus more than 40 kilometers north, cede several islands in the Gulf of Finland, and lease the Hanko Peninsula for 30 years to establish a naval base that would control all maritime access to Helsinki. In exchange, the Soviets offered remote and uninhabited territories in eastern Karelia. The Finnish negotiators, Juho Kusti Paasikivi and Väinö Tanner, immediately understood that acceptance would mean surrendering the very ability to defend themselves. They refused. Stalin, accustomed to the Baltic states yielding without resistance, did not take it well. On November 26, 1939, the Manila incident occurred. 7 artillery shells fell on Soviet territory near the border. Moscow accused Finland. Archives opened decades later confirmed what was already known in Helsinki. The shots had come from Soviet positions. It was Stalin's Tonkin incident, the fabricated pretext. 4 days later, the invasion began. The Soviet plan was simple in its ambition. The 7th Army was to attack directly across the Karelian Isthmus toward Viipuri and then Helsinki. Further north, other armies were to break through the narrow waist of the country near the towns of Suomussalmi and Tolvajärvi, split Finland in two and reach the Gulf of Bothnia. A puppet government was even installed in the captured border village of Terijoki, headed by the Finnish communist Otto Vilkuinen, with whom Stalin intended to sign peace after the conquest. The League of Nations expelled the USSR on December 14th, a gesture more symbolic than effective. No one came to Finland's aid. Sweden sent volunteers, about 8,000, and material, but refused to enter the war. France and Britain promised an expedition that never departed in time, partly because Norway and Sweden refused to let it pass through their territory, and then something happened that no one had foreseen. The winter of 1939 to 1940 was one of the coldest of the century. Temperatures at the front dropped below -40 degrees, in some places to -45. Soviet soldiers had been sent in olive green uniforms, perfectly visible against the snow, without adequate winter equipment in many units, with columns of tanks and trucks tied to the few passable roads, because leaving them meant sinking into deep snow or the frozen swamps beneath it. The Finns, by contrast, moved on skis, dressed in white, in small autonomous units that knew every forest, every frozen lake, every logging trail. They attacked the flanks, cut the Soviet columns into isolated segments they called moti, a Finnish word originally meaning a cubic meter of stacked firewood, and then destroyed them one by one. The Battle of Suomussalmi, fought between December and January, became the symbol of the war. 2 complete Soviet divisions, the 163rd and the 44th, totaling more than 45,000 men with artillery, tanks and armoured support, were annihilated by Finnish forces that at no point exceeded 11,000 effectives. The 44th Division, formed by Ukrainian troops transferred from a radically different climate, was immobilised for days on the Rat Road, a narrow road flanked by dense forest. The Finns, under Colonel Hjalmar Silasvuo, cut it into pieces. When the fighting ended, the road was covered with corpses frozen in the positions in which they had died, with abandoned trucks, T-26 and T-28 tanks, overturned field kitchens in which the soup had turned to ice. The Finns captured 43 tanks, 70 guns, 270 vehicles, 6,000 rifles, and resources the Finnish army desperately needed. The Soviet commander, Alexei Vinogradov, was shot in front of his own troops on direct orders from Moscow upon returning to Soviet territory. In the northern sector, a figure emerged who would become a legend, Simo Häyhä, a farmer from the village of Rautjärvi, 1 meter 50 tall, a former reservist. He reported to the front with his own Mosin Nagant rifle, model 28/30, without a telescopic sight because he preferred mechanical sights. The glass would glint and betray him, and his face would be less exposed when raising his head. He operated at temperatures down to -40 degrees, buried in the snow, with his mouth full of packed snow so that the vapour from his breath would not reveal him. In less than 100 days of combat, Finnish sources credit him with more than 500 confirmed kills with a rifle, a figure that makes him the deadliest sniper in documented history. Soviet soldiers began calling him Belaya Smrt, the White Death. On March 6, 1940, 6 days before the end of the war, explosive bullet shattered his jaw. He survived. He lived until 2002. He never wanted to talk much about it. When asked how he had become such a good shot, he replied with the laconic brevity characteristic of Karelian peasants. Practice. But the Winter War was not only individual heroism, it was also a desperate calculation of time. Mannerheim, 72 years old, appointed Marshal and Commander-in-Chief, knew that every week they held out brought the moment of collapse closer. Ammunition was running out. Replacements did not cover the losses. At the beginning of February 1940, Stalin reorganized his forces, dismissed the incompetent Voroshilov as front commander, placed General Semyon Timoshenko in command, concentrated unprecedented firepower on the Karelian Isthmus, and launched a total offensive against the Mannerheim Line. This time the Soviets attacked with renewed doctrine, sustained massive bombardments for hours, coordinated assaults with armour and sappers, continuous pressure that gave the defenders no respite. The line began to give way. In early March, the Soviets crossed the ice of Viipuri Bay. Finland's second largest city was on the verge of falling. Helsinki sued for peace. The treaty was signed on March 12, 1940, in Moscow, and entered into force the following day. Finland lost 11% of its territory, including all of Karelia with the city of Viipuri, part of the province of Salla, several islands, and had to lease Hanko to the Soviets for 30 years. 400,000 Karelians, 12% of the Finnish population, were evacuated westward in a few weeks, abandoning homes, farms and cemeteries with their dead. Not a single one agreed to remain under Soviet sovereignty. Finland had lost more than Stalin had demanded before the war, but it had preserved the essential, independence. Kuusinen's puppet government was quietly archived. Helsinki would not parade under occupation. For 16 months, Finland lived a tense peace they called the Provisional Peace. Everyone knew it was provisional. Stalin continued to pressure, demanding the concession of the nickel mines of Petsamo in the Arctic north of the country, crucial for the German alloy industry. He interfered in internal politics, vetoed presidential candidates, and pushed to incorporate Finland into the Soviet orbit as he had done with Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, annexed in the summer of 1940. An operation that in Helsinki was read as the exact preview of its own fate if no counterweight was found. The counterweight appeared in a familiar form. Germany, which had remained technically neutral during the Winter War to honour the pact with Stalin, began to approach. In the autumn of 1940, Berlin requested permission for German troops in transit to Norway to cross Finnish territory. Helsinki agreed. In exchange, it received weapons, ammunition, and the vague promise of protection. No one in the Finnish government had any illusions about the nature of the Nazi regime. Mannerheim, deeply conservative and with a Tsarist education, personally despised Hitler. But Finland had no other options. Sweden had declared itself neutral. Britain was fighting for survival on the other side of the continent. The United States remained far away. Between the USSR, which had shown exactly what it intended to do, and Germany, which at least offered weapons and a common enemy, the Finns chose the option that allowed them to continue existing. On June 22, 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Finland did not participate in the initial operation. Hitler, in his speech that day, mentioned that German soldiers were fighting alongside Finns, anticipating the facts. Helsinki formally protested. But on June 25th, Soviet aircraft bombed Finnish cities, including Helsinki, Turku and Porvoo, attacking factories and residential areas. Prime Minister Ryti appeared before Parliament that same afternoon and announced that Finland was once again at war with the Soviet Union. Thus began what in Finnish historiography is known as the Continuation War. The official Finnish position was, from the beginning, meticulously ambiguous. Finland was not an ally of Germany. It was a co-belligerent. It fought a separate war with separate objectives. The declared purpose was to recover the territories lost in 1940. No formal military pact was signed with Berlin. Mannerheim refused to subordinate his forces to German command and kept the Finnish chain of command independent. When Hitler visited him on June 4, 1942, on the occasion of the Marshal's 75th birthday, Mannerheim received him with icy courtesy, listened to his monologues, and even managed to have the Führer sign a copy of the visitor's book without committing to any joint operations. This meeting was secretly recorded by a Finnish radio engineer, Thor Darman, in the first minutes without Hitler knowing, and it is today the only existing recording of the Führer speaking in a private tone, not in a speech. The voice heard is almost intimate, hesitant, very different from the theatrical figure in the newsreels, an accidental historical document born of an uncomfortable war. At the front, the Finnish army reconquered Karelia in a few weeks, during the summer and autumn of 1941. Viipuri returned to Finnish hands on August 29th. The refugees began returning to their burned villages, but then Mannerheim made a crucial decision. He stopped. The Germans demanded that the Finnish army advance on Leningrad, which the Germans were besieging from the south, and close the ring from the north by crossing the Svir River. Mannerheim refused to cross the river toward Leningrad. He advanced to the Karelian Isthmus and stopped a few kilometers from the 1939 border, about 30 kilometers from the city. Finnish batteries did not fire on Leningrad. Finnish aircraft did not bomb the city. This refusal had enormous strategic consequences for the besieged, who kept open across Lake Ladoga the so-called Road of Life, the ice route through which supplies arrived in winter and which saved Leningrad from total surrender. This decision, which at the time infuriated Berlin, would decades later become one of the central arguments in Finland's defence against accusations of full collaboration with Nazism. It was not. Finland fought the USSR. It did not exterminate civilians. The 470 Finnish Jews served in the Finnish army without distinction. Some received German decorations that they rejected with black humour. There was a field synagogue on the Karelian front, a strange paradox. Finnish Jews celebrating Shabbat a few kilometres from German trenches. When the Gestapo, through the head of the security service Heinrich Müller during a visit to Helsinki, pressured the Finnish government to hand over the country's Jews, Minister Tanner and Prime Minister Rangel categorically refused. 8 foreign Jewish refugees were handed over by an official who acted outside instructions. 7 died in Auschwitz. The scandal was so great in Helsinki that the person responsible was removed, and there were no further deliveries. Finland is the only co-belligerent country of the Axis that protected its Jews until the end. But there are shadows in this story that must not be omitted. In eastern Karelia, occupied by Finnish troops between 1941 and 1944, territories conquered beyond the old border, internment camps were established for non-Finnish Slavic population. According to later investigations, about 4,000 civilians died there from hunger and disease. There was no policy of extermination, but there was negligence, racism toward Russians, and criminal conditions. Contemporary Finnish historiography has recognized this chapter. The war on the Eastern Front stabilized during 1942 and 1943 in what the Finns called the Trench War, a positional war with skirmishes, patrol raids and sporadic bombardments. Meanwhile, thousands of kilometers away, Stalingrad changed the course of the conflict. In February 1943, with the German Sixth Army annihilated, Helsinki began discreetly looking for an exit. There were contacts in Stockholm, soundings with Moscow, messages through Washington. The Soviet conditions were harsh: acceptance of the 1940 borders, expulsion of German troops from Finnish territory, payment of reparations. The divided Finnish parliament hesitated for months. The war, meanwhile, continued to consume Finnish lives in the rhythm of German defeats. In June 1944, at the same time as the Allies landed in Normandy, the Red Army launched the Vyborg-Petrozavodsk offensive against Finland. The fourth major strategic Soviet offensive of that summer employed more than 450,000 men, 10,000 guns, 800 tanks, and 1,500 aircraft. The Finnish forces on the isthmus were 1/5 of that magnitude. On June 20th, Viipuri fell for them. Second time. Helsinki was on the brink of military collapse. In this critical moment, Ryti, who had been elected president in 1940 and re-elected in 1943, did something extraordinary. He signed a personal letter to Hitler, the so-called Ryti-Ribbentrop Agreement, in which he committed himself as an individual, not as president, not to sign a separate peace with the USSR in exchange for immediate German military aid. The distinction was legally tortuous and deliberate. Germany sent material, including Part 40 anti-tank guns and Panzerfaust weapons, which proved decisive in the defensive battles of Tali-Ihantala, where between June 25th and July 9th, Finnish troops stopped the Red Army in the largest battle ever fought in Northern Europe. About 50,000 Finnish soldiers against 150,000 Soviets, with massive artillery on both sides. The Soviets lost tens of thousands of men and hundreds of tanks. The offensive halted. Ryti had bought time. Once the front was stabilized, in August 1944 he resigned the presidency. Parliament elected Mannerheim, who had not signed the letter, as the new president. The Marshal, with the moral authority of a man who had never personally committed himself to Hitler, informed Berlin that Finland was leaving the war. The armistice with the Soviet Union and Great Britain was signed in Moscow on September 19, 1944. The conditions were harsh, but Finland remained standing. The 1940 borders were confirmed with additional losses. Petsamo and its nickel mines passed to the USSR. Finland had to pay $300 million in reparations, an immense sum for a devastated economy, which it fulfilled to the last cent by 1952, astonishing the world and modernising its metallurgical and shipbuilding industry in the process. And one more clause, which sounded technical and turned out to be an entire war. Finland had to expel from its territory, by force of arms if necessary, the more than 200,000 German troops of the 20th Mountain Army under General Lothar Rendulic, stationed in the north of the country in Lapland. The deadline was immediate. Supervision was Soviet. If Finland did not comply, Soviet troops would enter to do it, which in practice would mean the occupation of the country. The Third War began, the Lapland War. In the first days there was a cynical choreography tacitly agreed upon between Finns and Germans. The Germans would withdraw slowly toward Norway. The Finns would pretend to pursue them. There would be symbolic fights for the Soviet cameras that were watching. No one had any desire to kill each other after 3 years of fighting side by side. But Soviet patience quickly ran out. Moscow demanded visible military actions. In October 1944, the war became real. Finnish troops under General Siilasvuo, same one from Suomussalmi, landed in Tornio on the coast of the Gulf of Bothnia, cutting German retreat routes. The fighting intensified. Rendulic, furious at what he saw as Finnish betrayal, ordered scorched earth tactics during the retreat. All of Lapland burned. German troops systematically burned houses, churches, schools, bridges and infrastructure. The city of Rovaniemi, the administrative capital of the region, was destroyed to 90%. Only the chimney of the railway station and some charred walls remained standing. Livestock was slaughtered or machine-gunned. The forests were mined. About 470,000 landmines remained in Lapland after the war. Some are still found today. 100,000 Laplanders, mostly Sami, had to be evacuated, many to Sweden. When they returned months or years later, they found only ashes. The fighting between Finns and Germans continued until April 1945. The last German troops left Finnish territory on April 27th, less than 2 weeks before Hitler's suicide. Finnish losses in the Lapland War amounted to about 1,000 dead and 3,000 wounded. The German losses were higher, but the figure that matters is another. Finland had fulfilled its obligation. The USSR had no excuse to enter. After the war ended, Finland looked at what it had paid. More than 90,000 dead and 200,000 wounded across the 3 wars in a country of barely more than 4 million inhabitants. 1 in every 80 Finns had died in combat. The final territorial loss represented 12% of the territory and nearly 13% of pre-war industrial capacity. 430,000 evacuated Karelians had to be resettled in a Finland that could barely feed itself. War reparations drained the economy. Southern cities had been bombed. Lapland was ashes. And yet something improbable had happened. Finland had not been occupied. There were no Soviet troops on its territory, a unique case among the countries bordering the USSR, except Turkey and neutral Sweden. It had preserved its parliament, its democracy, its legal system, its currency, its newspapers. The Communist Party was legalized, entered coalition governments, was monitored and contained, but never took power. In 1948, Stalin imposed a treaty of friendship and cooperation, the so-called FCMA Pact, which conditioned Finnish foreign policy but not internal policy. The uncomfortable concept of Finlandization was born: diplomatic self-censorship, deference to Moscow, careful balance so as not to provoke. Western intellectuals saw it for decades as a shameful form of submission. The Finns called it survival. In 1955, Finland joined the United Nations and the Nordic Council. In 1956, the USSR returned the Porkkala base, which had replaced Hanko in the armistice, at a time when Helsinki had expected it to remain occupied for another 44 years. In 1975, the city of Helsinki hosted the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe that produced the Helsinki Accords, a framework that would ultimately contribute to the dissolution of the Soviet bloc itself. The country that had once been invaded entered the diplomatic calendar as host of détente. In 1995, 6 years after the fall of the wall, Finland joined the European Union. In 2023, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it joined NATO. One question remains that historians continue to debate. Why did Finland survive when Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania did not? Why did Stalin, who easily swallowed the other Baltic countries, not complete the conquest of Finland in 1944 when he was militarily able to do so? The answers are several and overlap. Geography, undoubtedly. Finland was large, forested, and difficult to occupy. Military performance. The cost of a prolonged occupation after Talihantala and the Winter War seemed ruinous even for the USSR. The political calculation. Stalin preferred a neutral and contained Finland to an insurgent Finland. The figure of Mannerheim, an interlocutor who Moscow respected grudgingly and who offered guarantees of stability. And luck, always present in history. The moment, shifting priorities, a Europe that was reorganizing itself. But there is an explanation that the Finns themselves often give, and which is worth listening to. What Stalin saw in Finland was a country that would fight to the last man. It had proven it 3 times in 6 years, against him, with the Germans against the Germans. It was a country that did not accept conquest, that preferred destruction to incorporation. Strategic calculations exist, but sometimes a dictator looks at a small, stubborn country and decides it is not worth the effort. At the military cemetery of Hietaniemi in Helsinki, the marshals of Finland rest beside their soldiers. Mannerheim has there a simple grave of grey granite, without grandeur. A few metres away, the names of thousands of anonymous boys carved in stone. Veterans who were born before independence and died defending it. On one of the monuments, an inscription records a phrase attributed to an unknown Finnish soldier, found in a letter among his personal effects after his death at Talihantala in the summer of 1944. It does not have the solemnity of an official speech. It says only that the homeland is the place where friends have fallen, and that is why a Finn cannot flee. In that humble sentence of a nameless soldier lies the entire story. The impossible war of a small country that fought against almost all the great powers of its century, lost an eighth of its land, buried a generation of its sons. And yet, when the smoke cleared over Lapland and the last papers were signed in Moscow, it was still Finland,